so I've kind of titled today's lecture, The American Revolution, Conspiracy, Rhetoric, and the Enemy Above, because who loves a good conspiracy theory? We know Americans love conspiracy theories, and one thing they might not have told you when you took high school is that the American Revolution and America itself may have been founded as a conspiracy. So if you think about this, and I'll set up the lecture and the ideologies behind the revolution, and kind of show you how the fear of the enemy above has always been with us. It's always been a feature or a bug of our nation. And if we go back and we look at the revolution in a certain way, that's what we might think about. I know in Kansas, for instance, the last time they often go through the revolutions in like 5th grade. And so I remember my daughter's going through 5th grade and I see her Revolutionary War stuff. I'm like, well, what actually are you getting from this? And if you never take another history class again, you kind of have a baseline understanding of what this is. And today we're going to kind of get into some of the nuances of what the revolution were. So I'm going to start with this I guess, series of letters. This is British. This is not American. But it's called Cato's Letters. And I start with this one, and the specific quote from letter number 33 here, because this was perhaps the most famous and important piece of literature in America on the eve of the Revolution. If you look at the Founding Fathers, the people who supported the Revolution, this set of letters, this book was often the one that appeared most on their bookshelves. And so I'll read this quote to you and from Cato's letter 33, and we'll talk about what this means. Considering what sort of creature man is, it is scarce possible to put him under too many restraints when he is possessed of great power. He may possibly use it well, but they act most prudently who, supposing that he would use it ill, enclose him within certain bounds and make it terrible to him to exceed them. No man cares to be at the mercy of another, hence it is that if every man had his will, all men would exercise dominion and no man would suffer it. So if we stop right there, what do you think Cato's saying here in this first paragraph? It's kind of tough British philosophy, but what do you think he's saying? What is the nature of mankind? Do people crave power, do you think? Are people jealous? Do people want to do good things? Maybe. Do they want to do good things because it's the right thing to do, or do they want to do good things because of some restraint that has been put on them, some idea that it's the right thing to do good things? And that's what he's kind of getting in his first paragraph. What is the nature of mankind? He's saying, when you consider what a man is, just mankind, a human being, if you cannot put this man under any restraints, when this person has too much great power, they will probably not use that power prudently, meaning they will not use that power to benefit others. If you do not restrain someone's power, they will only get more and more powerful. And what will they use with that power? Well, they will use that power to maybe suppress dissent or take away liberties of other people that might challenge them or try to put restraints on them once they've accumulated power. So then we'll go into the second paragraph. But if you leave all men to boundless liberty, which they claim from nature, every man would be interfering and quarreling with another. Every man would be plundering the acquisitions of another. The labor of one man would be the property of another. Weakness would be the prey of force. And one man's industry would be the cause of another man's idleness. So what is he saying in this paragraph? If you give everybody power, what's going to happen?
We're just going to fail. It's going to get crazy because everyone has
Okay. People are going to start going crazy. There's going to be anarchy, chaos, theft, stealing. Boundless liberty is also a bad thing. So I want to talk to you about who Cato was. Cato was not the writer of these letters. These were two people of the Whig tradition. We'll talk about who the Whigs were in a second. They were British people. They were educated. Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard. But they were actually using this guy, Cato the Younger, as inspiration. They were well read on the old Roman Republic. And probably if you remember anything from Roman history, you probably remember Julius Caesar, right? The guy who started the Roman Empire. But before he started the Roman Empire, there was a Roman Republic. And Caesar eventually came to dominate, and the Republic collapsed, and Caesar took control. Cato the Younger was one of the last leaders of Rome as a republic, and when Caesar came to power, Cato killed himself. He stabbed himself in the stomach, his entrails spilled out everywhere, and while his supporters came to kind of shove them back in and save his life, he died. And so using this guy as an inspiration, like the death of an empire, or the death of a republic, and the birth of an empire teaches you about the history of governments as a whole. The idea that if you have a society, why do we have government? Is government necessary?
Yes.
Yes. Why is government necessary?
I would say sustain the power, really, to give ruling and give order.
Okay. Give order. Excellent. Thank you. They give order. If we don't have governments, we live in a world of chaos and anarchy. So governments give order. And that's essentially where I'm going to lead you to. What is the role of government as a whole? And I want you to think about government on a line here, that this is the other Enlightenment thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who came up with the idea of the social contract. If you go back to like the first organizations of men, if you have boundless liberty, boundless freedom, the idea that anyone can do whatever they want, whenever they want to do it, that's going to be chaotic. There'll be a violent, primordial world of brutes taking from other people, stealing, accumulating power, accumulating wealth, and taking for themselves. So people, in order to kind of stop groups from having too much power, they form social orders. They form a social contract. And to do that, they say, we will have to give up some of our liberties in exchange for more order in society. I might not be able to drive down the highway at 150 miles per hour because that's against the law, because that's reckless. Driving a high rate like that might be fun for me if I had boundless liberty to do so, but that puts other people's lives at risk. So I accept the exchange that I'll drive a more reasonable 65 miles per hour in order to keep society more orderly and less chaotic. That's kind of what the role of government should aim to do, according to Rousseau. We willingly give up these total freedoms in exchange for some order. However, things can go poorly. In a society with too much anarchy, we see the Anglican clergyman, he's allied with Britain, Reverend Seabury, who says, if I must be enslaved, let it be by a king at least, and not by a parcel of upstart lawless committeemen. If I must be devoured, let me be devoured by the jaws of a lion, and not gnawed to death by rats and vermin. So who is this guy? Well, he's what we call a loyalist. Because in the American Revolution, it's estimated about 25 to 30% of people were pretty actively patriotic. About 15 to 20% were loyalists who wanted to stay loyal to Britain. And the other 50 were kind of on the fence. Which side are we going to go with, Britain or America? What's in it for us? And so loyalists who are saying, why would we want to give more power to all the rats, all the local people, when I'd rather give my power to one king in England 3,000 miles away? Then there's another reverend, and this guy is, I believe, from Boston, John Allen. He says, then surely, my lord, America has the same right to oppose every usurping power. Let it be from whom it will that assaults his person or deprives him of his own law or liberty as an American. Has he offended? Yes. Is he willing to be tried by his own laws? Yes. Then that man, that king, that minister of state, be who he will, is worse than a Nero tyrant that shall assume to drag him 3,000 miles to be tried by his enemies. So this guy's a patriot. The king is a tyrant. The real tyrant is the thousands of rats in my own neighborhood who want power and crave it. So what is a good government going to be then? If you have a king, there's too much power, there's too much order in society, which means you have few liberties and freedoms. As such, that is a society of tyranny. If you have no laws, no orders, that's a society of anarchy. So what you're looking for is that sweet middle, that central part. And that's what the Whigs desired. The Whigs were kind of philosophers and government theorists, and what they decided was that what we need are people, leaders, who have republican virtue, who want to become leaders, not for their own self-gain or their self-interest or their own self-benefit, but for the good of the whole. And how do we make sure that those leaders are there for the good of the whole? We put checks and balances on them. We make it so that one person cannot have too much unrestrained power, and as such, that person can thus lead for the good of the whole instead of for their own self-benefit. And so It sounds easy in theory, but that's the principle behind government, that you want to occupy that sweet spot where people have some liberties and some freedoms and the things that are enshrined in our documents, like the Declaration of Independence, but not a society that is ruled by a tyrant whose every whim becomes law, whose every decision is something that they want to do on their own. So what Jean-Jacques Rousseau said in The Social Contract, that if you get to a society where you have one person, a tyrant, a Nero, like of Roman Empire. Nero is famous because he allegedly fiddled while Rome was burning, because there was all kinds of conspiracy theories that Nero wanted Rome to burn so that him and his cronies could go buy up cheap land and profit themselves. So he fiddled while Rome burned was the saying at the time. That you don't want leaders like that. And when you have a leader like that, the social contract has been broken. As such, the people can rise up and overthrow that leader to institute a government for the good of the people. So, at its core, that is the ideology behind the revolution. And starting to see, from this perspective, if you're down on this end and you have a tyrant, this is the enemy above. They have too much power and you lack freedom. And that's kind of where we're headed for the next few weeks with all the rest of our examples in American history of why Americans start to fear the enemy above. By the end of this week, we're going to get into militias and modern-day militia movements. We're going to get into Oklahoma City bombing, among other things, and how people in the 1990s began to fear that America had grown too strong and too powerful, and as such had to be restrained, so they decided to start blowing up federal buildings. And if you look at a lot of these militia movements, they actually use the Revolutionary War symbols a lot in their names, in their symbols, their uniforms, these paramilitary militia outfits use. They always kind of revert back to the revolution for their kind of inspiration. All right, so I'll give you a few other parts of the ideology. George Washington. You guys know George Washington, yeah? First president. Here's a letter he writes 2 years before the Declaration of Independence. He's writing to his friend Brian Fairfax. For my own part, I shall not undertake to say where the line between Great Britain and the colonies should be drawn, but I am clearly of opinion that one ought to be drawn, and our rights clearly ascertained. I could wish, I own, that the dispute had been left to posterity to determine, but the crisis is arrived when we must assert our rights or submit to every imposition that can be heaped upon us, till custom and use will make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. There's a lot to digest in this one. What do you think Washington is saying to his buddy, Mr. Fairfax? I mean, this is future President George Washington. Yeah.
Always known that George Washington was he was for the slaves, he was wanting the slaves.
Yeah, he had 317 slaves. Many of them who he inherited when he got married to Martha Washington, whose first husband was a huge enslaver of human beings. So he has personal firsthand experience of what it means to have complete dominion and absolute power over another person. And how is he using that personal experience of his time as an enslaver to inform America's developing relationship with Britain? Saying they're going to turn us into slaves like we have turned African slaves into slaves. There is some weird paradoxical hypocrisy here. That the founding fathers, many of whom were enslavers, are fighting for liberty, rights, and freedoms, at the same time that they also enslave and take away and deprive people of rights, liberties, and freedoms. And that is the great paradox of the revolution. In fact, when I was in grad school, one of my first semesters, I had one of my final exams was like a 25-page essay, and they were like, now that you've taken this whole class on like 1700s American history, write a 25-page paper that explains the American paradox. How could a nation of people who claim to be the most liberty-loving, democratic, free people in the world also have slaves? Explain the paradox. And so that is a big trick to do. And to their part, people like Washington and Jefferson began to kind of actually note their hypocrisy. And so what Washington did, and this is during the Revolutionary War, this is a painting by John Trumbull here of Washington in 1780. This is during the war. And it's kind of hard to see with the light, but you can see in the background, is William Lee, who he referred to as his manservant. Well, William Lee was his slave. But in Washington's, after he's president, in 1799, the Revolutionary War is victorious. In Washington, in his last will and testament, he says, to William Lee, I give immediate freedom. I allow him in basically a salary of $30 a year for the rest of his life to be taken care of. Doesn't sound like a lot, but in those days it's enough to live off of for a year. He has been accustomed to receive, if he chooses the alternative, but with his freedom, I give him a testimony of his attachment to me and his faithful services in the Revolutionary War. It wasn't just Washington. Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, other places in the North, they began to enact emancipation laws or gradual emancipation laws. They began to note the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom and liberty against Britain while the presence of slavery did exist. And Washington freed at least the slaves that he could that were controlled by him. And he says, upon my wife Martha's death, I will free the 123 slaves who work at Mount Vernon, but the other 190 or so were controlled by the Custis estate, which was Martha's first husband, and they had bequeathed those enslaved people to Martha's children to her first husband. One of which actually would later on, down the line of lineage, be Robert E. Lee. If you know Robert E. Lee was, he was the general of the South in the CSA who fought against the North. And so he has a connection back to George Washington. So this is part of our understanding. If you go back to our understanding of what role of government is, we will rule over them with dominion and power, but Britain is going to turn us into tame and abject slaves. So if you think about that phrasing, it's almost like a conspiracy theory. Britain wants to turn us into slaves. You actually see this quite a bit in several readings of the time period. Will Britain turn us into slaves by the laws they're passing that we don't have control over? And that conspiracy rhetoric, that language, is thus kind of being the motor or the power behind the revolution. So now I want to give you 4 examples of the Revolutionary War and how this kind of plays out and how Americans view themselves as a victim of British imposition or British power. And to do that, we're going to use the Declaration of Independence, because most of you have probably read the Declaration of Independence. But most of you, when you've read the Declaration, you probably only really pay attention to the first part, the famous first paragraph, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, yada, 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 so forth, so forth. What's the second part of the Declaration? Anyone know? The second part, which is actually about 90% of the Declaration. It is an airing of grievances. It is a laundry list. Everything we don't like about Britain and our rationale for why we want independence for them and to choose to go to war with them. So I've kind of taken out some of those clips from the Declaration to kind of show you what actual things on the ground Americans feared, why they feared this enemy above, and why Britain needed to be separated from Britain. And to do this, we'll start first with a major global war called the French and Indian War. It's actually part of a much larger war called the 7 Years' War. It involved France and Spain and Russia and Prussia, which was essentially Germany now, England, Sweden, lots of nations involved with this one. But in the Americas, which is where we're focused on, it involved mostly the French, who were allied with the Indians, who were fighting the British, allied with the Americans, mostly over land rights in the West, in Ohio. This began in 1754 when, again, George Washington leaves from Virginia to go to the Ohio Valley to scout land. He wants land, which the French claim that they control, that they have title to. Some fights break out with Native Americans who live there, and this eventually spirals into a major war when the British send lots of troops over to the Americas to take rightful ownership of the Ohio Valley region, as it's called. Lots of rivers here, great farmland for prospective settlers to move to as part of this global war of land control. So Native Americans mostly side with the French in this case. They have better relations with the French, except for the Iroquois who side with the British. But for the most part, France is winning the war at first until Britain starts to invest a lot of money. They spin their way to victory. They go into great debt. They build a huge navy. They attack the French in the Caribbean. They attack the French in Europe. And then they start to attack the French throughout Canada and the Ohio Valley region, western New York, western Pennsylvania. And eventually the French capitulate and the British win this war. And so as such, that's why Canada becomes Canada, because France maintains hold of Canada for a time, and then at the end of this war, they've lost it to the British because the French settled Canada. So the British now control Canada, and all of North America. But there's still a French population there and French civilians who get incorporated into the British Empire. But at the end of this war, in 1761, as France is losing, what begins to happen as the Native Americans now become subjects to the British and these allies? And so what the British start to do, and one of the first things they did, and one of the reasons why the Native Americans sided with the French, because the French gave gifts, meaning trade gifts. And the French gave gifts to the Native Americans to get them on their side. And then one of the first things Britain does at the end of this war says, we're not going to give you any more presents. The gifts, the trades, they're over. And so what happened in 1761, as this map shows right here, is a massive rebellion against Britain by Native American tribes. Over 14 tribes start to attack British forts throughout the Ohio Valley that they had taken control from the French. And this is, if you've ever heard of history of the British giving smallpox blankets to the Native Americans, that's this war. So that's the gifts they start to give to them were blankets used by smallpox victims. Did it actually spread smallpox? There's no evidence of that. But the intent might be there to use some biological warfare, possibly. And Americans begin to refer to this war as Pontiac's War, also showing this kind of idea of the enemy above. Pontiac was important. He was the chief of the Ottawa tribe. He was mostly around what is modern-day Detroit. But there were 14 tribes and 14 different chiefs all joining a confederacy together to attack British forts throughout the Ohio Valley region. So why do we call it Pontiac's War? Because a lot of times Americans like to invest a single person as the leader or power behind a movement. There is no real evidence that Pontiac was the leader of this entire confederacy. In fact, he had been inspired by a prophet named Neolin, and as many others in the region had been inspired by this prophet too. But that just shows you a little how Americans view the world. So in the Declaration of Independence, when it says, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose of obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, but mostly to encourage their migrations hither. He is referring to what happens as a result of this war. So what does the British do? They eventually kind of curtail this rebellion, but one of the things they do by 1763 is they pass a new law called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And that's this red line here. It roughly follows the Appalachian Mountains. So what do you think this line is?
Is it a border?
It's a border. And who's going to be on the left-hand side of the border? Some British, but mostly Native Americans. Basically saying, you Americans in Pennsylvania, in Virginia, and North Carolina, you cannot migrate to the west of the Appalachians. You cannot pass beyond this line. The only people that can go beyond this line are British troops stationed in forts and official traders that have a royal trading license signed by the king to go into these areas to trade your goods with Native Americans. And if you remember, this whole thing started because George Washington wanted land. That's why they're mad. They have stopped us from raising the conditions of appropriations of lands. They have restricted our freedom of movement, and they're stopping us from going into new territory. So that is why they view them as an enemy above. You're destroying our chance at business, at commerce, at stealing land from Native Americans. That's part of their problem that they've laid out in the Declaration here. Now, this is all a matter of perspective. I'm going to show you a trailer here. This is from I think John Wayne's in this one. It's called Allegheny Uprising. I want you to listen. This is about the French and Indian War, but also about the Pontiac's Rebellion, really. This is like, I think, a 1950s movie. Could be wrong on the date. Okay, a little American cultural history. How is America remembering this war against the Native Americans? What are some phrases that stood out to you? The first fight for freedom. Who are they fighting against? Well, Native Americans, but also who else? The British troops who are stopping them from moving to the territory. And John Wayne being portrayed as this heroic colonist of American settlers who want to sweep tomorrow's mighty empire forward to the west, but are being stopped by the unscrupulous traders and merchants and officers of the King's Majesty and army. what's the truth here? This is a movie kind of about what's called the Pontiac or the Paxton Boys. The Paxton Boys were basically a group of, one could refer them as terrorists, depending on the matter of perspective you'd call. They marched into a village in December 1763, and they scalped 20 Native Americans. They scalped their heads. They murdered 20 people, including women. And why did they do this? Revenge for earlier uprisings in the Ohio Valley, but also because they were mad that Pennsylvania wouldn't pass a bounty law, which would allow them to turn in Indian scalps in exchange for cash. And so then they planned to march on Philadelphia with the scalps and other things to demand payment and resist the royal governors that they said were stopping their movement west. Does that sound like the fight of a fight for freedom? Perspective. If you're a Pennsylvanian, yes, because if you feel like this land, if you're entitled to this land to the west, you are being restricted on your freedom. But if you're the Native Americans, well, your enemy is the external enemy of the Americans who want to take your land. And if you're the king, the enemy is the enemy below, the American colonists who are violating your laws, that you can't go west. So that's why when this whole class, the idea of enemies, it's all a matter of perspective. Enemies above, enemies below, enemies within, the external enemy, they all get shifted around based on who the perspective is. And so for the American point of view, the colonial point of view, they feel like they've been mistreated. Do they have any argument to show that they've been mistreated here? What would be your argument to say, this is not fair, that the king has limited their mobility and restricted their freedom of where they can move? Try to defend America for a second. What would you say? Well, who passed that law? Who made this proclamation line? Britain. Were any Americans allowed in the negotiation process? Do any Americans serve in Parliament to help negotiate these treaties? So what do we call this in America? Representation. We are not represented in England, in your parliament, and you make these laws without our consent and without people that we can vote into office that stands for our represented ideal. That's the main thing. And that's kind of what the Boston Tea Party, our second position, gets to. For cutting off trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent. So we got some political cartoons here. The first is Philip Daw, he's actually British, saying Bostonians in distress. What is this cartoon? You're an expert on propaganda now that we've done our activity. What is this? This is a propaganda cartoon, a political cartoon. What does this suggest on the left here? So they are actually feeding them fish. There's people on this boat, and they've got little platters of fish that they're sliding through the bars. So Bostonians are in distress because they've been held in a cage. And where's the cage hanging from? The Liberty Tree. What does that suggest? Is that sarcasm, maybe? The British are taking away your liberty because your liberty is actually in a cage. And then what's on the island all below the Bostonians? British troops, British cannon, all these things showing that Bostonians have been held captive. We'll talk about what this is in relation to in a second. All right, what about this on the right here for you? What does this picture suggest? This is when they dump all the tea in Boston Harbor, right? You guys know the Boston Tea Party? Is that one thing they teach you about growing up? What did you learn about the Boston Tea Party? Do you remember anything that they told you about this?
Just that they threw tea in the water.
Because what?
They threw tea in the water.
They threw tea in the water. Why did they throw a bunch of tea in the water?
Taxes.
Because they were being taxed. And they didn't want to pay their taxes. Were Americans right to do this? What do you think? People don't like paying, I don't like paying taxes. I don't want to pay my taxes. I'm going to go destroy about $1 million worth of tea. Is this terrorism? Absolutely. This is destruction of property. But the social contract. If the government has taken away your rights and liberties, you are allowed to break that contract and resist laws you don't agree with. Because what is their argument here? So when we get to this idea of trade and taxation, Boston Tea Party has been greatly mythologized and misconstrued for some of the actual history. So what is the truth behind the Boston Tea Party? They were mad because they lowered the tax. They actually cut the tax on tea by 1/3. The tax on tea used to be like 9 pence, and they cut it to 3 pence. And the Americans were so mad that they cut the tax to 1/3 of its normal level that they destroyed a bunch of tea. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't make sense. So it wasn't just about tea. It was about taxes. It was about other things too. And one of the main things, they passed a Tea Act basically in 1773. And what the Tea Act basically said was that Bostonians can only bring in tea from one company in England. That company is the only group that can sell tea legally in Boston. Now, what if you are, okay, so who's the first person to sign the Declaration of Independence? Anyone know? He's got the big flowing signature. John Hancock, see? I love this, because you can see his name down here. Little tiny scribbles, but John Hancock's big in the center and right at the top. So what do you guys know about John Hancock? Let's watch a video. Well, we'll come back in a second. We'll learn more about John Hancock in a second. How did John Hancock make his money, do you think? He, in his words, is a trader. I bring in goods for people and I sell them, and he's very wealthy doing this. Britain says, you're not a trader, you're a smuggler. You're a criminal. And why? Because we have all these laws that have been on the books since the 1600s. 1650s, really. Navigation Acts, as they called it. What is the purpose of the colony if you're Britain? The purpose of the colony is to benefit Britain, which means they pass a law that says your colony can only trade with Britain. So what does John Hancock do? Well, he goes to France and most of the French islands with his boats in the Caribbean. And they're not allowed to trade with France because France is Britain's rival. But France is making a lot of sugar with slave labor in the Caribbean island. And there's an off product of sugar when they use to make it, when they crystallize the sugar. And that is molasses. And do you know what they use to make molasses? They make rum from molasses. And John Hancock smuggles a lot of rum into Boston. So basically you could say that this is a gangland drug war. That it's not just the Tea Act here, but John Hancock wants to continue to smuggle in illegal goods, namely, they're not illegal because it's illegal to drink rum, but they're illegal because they're bringing them from France, and that is illegal. And for the longest time, Britain didn't care. Britain didn't really crack down on smugglers. Guys like John Hancock could operate, bring in their goods. Nobody really cared. But now that Britain's in huge debt after the French and Indian War, they want to start actually enforcing the law, enforcing the trade, enforcing taxes, and getting them to help the Americans to pay down their debt. And John Hancock's like, well, that's different than what used to be. You used to let us have freedom to ship with all the French rum we wanted to, and molasses to make our own rum that we wanted. Now you're saying we can't do this, and you're restricting our liberties. He also brought in tea as well from other places, from the Dutch or from Spain or from China, other places. So he had a global network of trade. But now he's saying you can only bring in English tea. And so that's the conflict on the harbors of Boston that day. There's a bunch of boats out there holding tea from this British East India Tea Company. And they know as soon as that tea gets brought onto the land that people start buying it and the blockade will be broken. So they don't want the governor, who's appointed by the king, to let the boats land and ship the tea. And that's why they finally decide to go on the boats and just dump the tea versus letting the tea come on land. Because they're upset about monopoly in trade and freedom of trade. The taxing part, it's there a little bit. But let's talk about taxes. Because most of the time people remember Boston Tea Party and they're like, oh, people don't want to pay their taxes. Well, I've already told you they lowered the taxes. So let's take a look at this. In the sense of British debt here. Their debt, 140 million pounds, had doubled because of the 7 Years' War. Every year they're adding 5 more million pounds in debt. If you add all this up for British subjects and all their entire empire, that's 18 pounds per person to pay down their debt. A pound's a lot of money. A person's entire business was worth about 18 to 30 pounds. So basically, like an entire small business is about 18 pounds. It's not like $18. It's a lot of money. The British are also saying, we're paying to protect your frontier. We're paying 135,000 pounds to staff those forts to protect you from Native American attacks. And the Americans are like, well, we don't want your troops there because we want to move on those lands anyway. And Britain's like, well, we need to protect our interest, our investment in the colonies. Average taxes paid. All right, this is where things get interesting. Were Americans being taxed to death? No. Your average British person paid 50 times as much in taxes as your American citizen. If your average British person paid about 25 shillings, these are all from Rick Atkins' book, The British Are Coming, these figures, if you want to look this up. 25 shillings in taxes paid per year by English citizen. Americans paid the British crown, the royal crown, 6 pence. 12 pence is 1 shilling, 1 shilling, or 20 shillings is 1 pound. So basically, each British person is paying a little over £1, and each American person is paying a fraction of that. So if you add this up, basically today, that means if an American paid $2.25 in tax, your average British person is paying $112.50. They teach you this in high school? No. Why not? Because they're not paying a lot of taxes. Now, they had other taxes. They had colonial taxes. They had stuff within that went to their colonial governments. But when it comes to like the actual taxing that went back to England, they weren't being taxed hardly anything at all. So really, it's not about paying the tax. And I just told you, they cut the tax by 1/3. So, British officials also estimate that 700,000 pounds of taxable goods are going through untaxed because of smugglers like John Hancock are illegally bringing things in and not paying taxes on them, while Britain is in debt. And that's basically the stats for you. So what's the problem here? If you're Britain, who's the enemy below? Smugglers, people violating the law, people that aren't paying their taxes. Does the government have the right to tax? What do you think? Should governments have the right, the power to tax? Yes. Well, what if you say no? Then how does the government fund itself? How do police officers get funded, or school teachers, or fire departments? And you say we should just privatize everything. Well, what happens when you have a private fire department? Well, can you pay to put out the fire? Oh, you can't? Sorry. Maybe we're not going to put your fire out. Or maybe you're going to go into debt because you have to pay when you have a fire. Or in a worst case scenario, maybe like, well, our fire company hasn't had a lot of fires lately. Go out and set some fires so we can make some money. That's why there's a reason why firefighters are not a private company. They tried that in the 1850s. They were a disaster. People in the New York City, they had rival fire companies, and they show up about who has the right to put the fire out, and they just get into fistfights outside the building about who has the right to put out the fire, while the fire consumed the whole structure. So the idea there is some things have to be funded by the government, and the only way you can do that is by taxing the people. So, yes, governments have the right to tax. What does this cartoon suggest right here? That it's not about the tax itself, it's about what? Taxation without representation. It's not that you're taxing us, it's that you're taxing us without our consent. You're taxing us without us having a voice or a say. Remember in one of the posters from the Module 2, I think it was Natalia's group, and they talked about how soldiers were being drafted to go to the Vietnam War, and they were 18, 19 years old, and they were going and they were dying and getting wounded in Vietnam, and they're like, you're putting us in this war, and we don't even get to vote for the leaders who are drafting us to go to a war. This is a very similar principle, the idea that you're taking away our liberty, our freedom to make us into soldiers without our consent because we can't vote for the representatives who might be against this war in the first place. And that's a similar refrain. So that's what the Americans are really upset about. It's the consent piece, not so much the tax itself. But in our collective memory, we all think, oh, it's the tax, and taxes are terrible, and no one likes paying taxes at all, but we have to do it. They're a necessary evil. But then anytime the Boston Party gets remembered, it's always about, hey, taxes. People hate taxes. No one is ever going to run for office on that. I'm going to raise your taxes and because I want to have more higher taxes on everybody. That person's not going to win an election, likely. All right, the third imposition. All right, you know what this is? Boston Massacre. Heard of this one? What do you know about this one? What do they teach you in school about this? What?
Or weren't they meeting and then they got massacred in Boston?
All right. Yeah, the British showed up and they get in a line and then they slaughtered a bunch of Americans. Now, how do you look at the, can you see this? Do you guys know who made this woodcut by chance? Paul Revere. He was a silversmith, but he also made political cartoons like this one. And a woodcut is like something that you do and make a print, and then you can reproduce it and put up in flyers all around the town. And so what can you tell about this? Anything, it's kind of hard to see a little bit, but is there any kind of words or imagery that stands out to you?
Anything about the building?
The British are the villains. How do you know they're the villains?
No, I'm talking about the building.
The what?
I was like, is there anything with the building?
The buildings. Yeah, there's the buildings right here. Can you see what this one says? No? Butcher's Hall. Butcher's Hall. What else do we see here? Are the Americans firing back? Are the Americans armed? What else is going on with those Americans? Some are running away. What else? Blood. This is gory. There's blood all over the ground here. This guy's been shot in the head. This British guy is kind of smiling here. This is propaganda. So what's the truth? What actually happened here? Well, in the Declaration of Independence, quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. This is a newspaper edition about a report of the Boston Massacre and the death of some people that were killed by the British. So raising some questions here. Why are the British there? Why are the British shooting unarmed civilians? 5 people died here. And to your point, they shot these people because there were a bunch of kids around packing some snowballs with rocks and stuff and pebbles and chucking them at the soldiers and making fun of them and calling them lobsters. And then, because of their red coats, and picking on these, a bunch of schoolboys just throwing snowballs at soldiers. And then a surlier, rowdier crowd of mobs started joining the boys and started getting in the face of the soldiers, and they got panicky and they shot into the crowd and 5 people died. So what should happen to soldiers when they shoot at an unarmed crowd and kill 5 people? Should they be held accountable?
The commander should be on it.
Or was it self-defense, where they stand their ground?
That the Americans were wrong for stopping it.
So it's a question of disproportionate force, maybe. Do you have the right to shoot someone who's throwing a snowball at you? Well, if you make the argument that the snowball could have endangered my life because there was a rock in it, maybe. But it's kind of a tough legal argument. Do you know who came to the defense? Who is the lawyer who defended the Boston Massacre soldiers? John Adams. You know who John Adams is? Second President of the United States. He defends the Boston Massacre soldiers, and he mostly gets all of them off without much punishment. By basically saying, yeah, it was self-defense. They were being attacked by a mob. They fired into the crowd. One of them got punished by being branded on the thumb, and then most of them went back home. But John Adams, who was slowly being brought along to the idea of the revolutionary ideas of the patriotism and American independence, he thought that everyone deserves a trial, everyone deserves a good lawyer, everyone deserves counsel, even British troops that fire into a crowd of Americans. And so it's actually an American who defends them. Yet in the Declaration of Independence, we protected these soldiers the king protected these soldiers by a mock trial for murdering our people. Which leads to the larger question, why are troops on the street of Boston anyway?
It's like they were looking for just excuse, basically.
Maybe. Why are troops there, you think? Now we got my other video here. Why are there troops on the street of Boston? Because they're tarring and feathering people. Who's this guy that gets tarred and feathered? He's a British bureaucrat in the video. In this case, this guy is in charge of the ships. Which ships can come into port, which ships have paid their taxes, their import duties, which ships can start to unload their goods on the shore. Are they actually British goods or are they smugglers? And then John Hancock confronts him. It's kind of a version of the tarring and feathering of John Malcolm. There's a real life tarring and feathering scene. There was about at least a dozen of these that we know happened in American history. The first starting after the Townshend Acts were passed in the 1760s. And the Townshend Acts were taxes on like paper and tea and lead and paint and other goods that the British were selling. A way to kind of pay down their debts from the French and Indian War. They started taxing goods. What do you call that today? We call that a sales tax. That coffee you're drinking, it's $1, but probably like $1.10 or whatever after you paid your sales tax on it. Because that's how the government pays some of its debts, is through sales taxes, pay through goods. Does the government have the right to pass a sales tax? According to them, they do. But if someone says, I don't have representation, I didn't agree to pay the sales tax, I'm not giving you 10 cents McDonald's. Well, they'd say, then you're not getting this coffee. The government has passed the sales tax. We must collect the tax and pay the state, or else they'll shut us down. And so what begins to happen then is that Americans show up and they begin threatening tax collectors. And in this case, this is in the 1760s after the Townshend Act is passed. This might have been the Stamp Act. Anyway, these tax collectors are being held down here. And how are the Americans portrayed both in this video? This is from HBO's series John Adams, and this is a cartoon from the 1760s. How are Americans portrayed in these pieces here? Are Americans the good guys? No. They're not? What do you think?
Pretty like barbaric.
Okay. Hooligans, barbarians, violent rioters. What would any government do in the case of your tax collectors? So if you show up at McDonald's and you organize a bunch of St. Mary students to go mobilize McDonald's and not pay sales tax there, what is going to happen to you? Well, they'll probably call in the police. If it gets out of control, they'll call in the National Guard. And essentially, they will shut down your protest because you are creating disorder, anarchy, chaos, and order is not present. That's why the troops are there. Does Britain have the right to send in the troops? In their mind, absolutely, because they have to enforce their laws and maintain order in their colony. They view this as the mob, the enemy below, who's rioting against them and not following their laws. But if you're from the American perspective, you have now quartered troops among us. Not only have you quartered troops among us, your troops are now shooting our people because we threw some snowballs at you, and they don't get punished for it. So the enemy above is that we don't have the right to these taxes, we don't have representation of these taxes, we don't have representation to say the troops can be called out to protect cities, and we have no say in the control or direction of where we live. It's a matter of perspective. Enemy above, enemy below. All right, so imposition number 4. Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, the founding documents of this country. 1776, July 4th, when it was finally put forth. And our last line from the document that we're going to go through today, he, in all these cases, when it says he, they are all reference to the king. He has done this. The king has done this. This arbitrary power, this monarchy has done this. That's why you see this happening over and over and over again. The king has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has excited domestic insurrection among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, conditions of existence. Yeah, this is actual phrasing from the Declaration. What are they accusing the king of in the last imposition here? You are sending mercenaries to our shore. Who are these mercenaries that they're sending, do you know? They're called Hessians, Hessian soldiers. They're from Germany. You guys ever see Legend of Sleepy Hollow when you were a kid? The Ichabod Crane, the headless horseman? And he's galloping through the countryside, and the horseman wants to cut his head off and take it. He's a Hessian. America's first ghost story, America's first horror story, the villain is a Hessian mercenary from the Revolutionary War who was killed after being found out to be, by a local population, but haunts the grounds in search of people's heads. That's why they're terrified of Britain. They're sending mercenaries to do their good. When America gets its first major victory in the Revolutionary War, one of the first major victories, it's at the Battle of Trenton when they cross the Delaware River. You remember the picture of Washington on a boat going across the Delaware? They're attacking a village of Hessians on Christmas Day. And they score a major victory that helps build their morale to win the war. And in part two, what are they accusing Americans of doing, or the British are doing? Aligning with Native Americans to wage war against us. So as part of this document, what it's saying, how is America going to respond when Britain is beginning to send troops over to put down a rebellious insurrection of revolters, rioters, protesters? Well, this is where we get into our militias that we're going to talk about. Paul Revere, you know him not for the guy who made the Boston Massacre woodcut. You know him as the what? The guy who rode around the countryside warning the people that the British are coming. Now, again, we like to invest people with heroic properties. There was actually 30 horsemen out that night. Paul Revere's actions were actually fairly limited compared to some of the other guys like William Dawes or Samuel Otis. He actually gets arrested and then talks his way out of it and then moves around some blockades and just goes home. But remember the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere because his name ends in Revere, and William Longfellow realized I could rhyme his last name better than Otis, and he wrote a poem about him in the 1830s, and that's why you all remember the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So, culture, memory, and our collective conscious. How does this propaganda or this political cartoon, what does this suggest about the Revolutionary War people in America? Who are the Minutemen? People who can be ready in a minute to do what? Fight against the British, to resist. So when Revere and others rode around the countryside, what were they warning about the British? Why did they have to warn the British? What were the British, where are they coming? We know they're coming from, but where are they going to? They're going to the armories at Concord. They're going to take Americans' guns and cannon, artillery, gunpowder, all that stuff, and they're going to control this armory. So they're running around the countryside warning them the British are coming to take our way to resist. We have to get to the armory and get our stuff out. And so the Minutemen start coming out of homes and farms, and they organize in the woods, and they create skirmishes. They slow the British down at a skirmish in Lexington. They cause them to get delayed, so that by the time that the British do show up at Concord, this is the first battle of the Revolution, much of the stuff has been removed, and they get to keep their weapons, their equipment, their guns, their gunpowder, their bullets, their shells. So the idea that, we talk about this moment is the idea of the individual Minuteman waking up from his bed, grabbing his musket from the bedside, attacking the British, but it's kind of it's a bit of a myth. This was actually a well-trained military force. They had colonial militias. Colonial militias were there to protect towns. Men who were able-bodied they did public service by serving in militias. They basically got them together to organize, to get their weapons out, and to train, and part of their civic duty of republicanism, to protect the common interest, in this case, which is keep our weapons out of the hands of the British so we can continue to resist as needed. So this is where things escalate. Britain then sends a lot more troops over. They fight them at Bunker Hill. They plead to the king at the Continental Congresses we don't want independence from the king. We just want more rights. We want representation in Parliament. Our problem is Parliament, not the kings right now. But the king blows them off. King George III doesn't respond to them and forces Americans' hands, and that's when they declare the independence in July 4th, 1776. So now that we've kind of covered some of the major, ideological underpinnings of this moment, and this is our final myth, a bunch of people getting together in a room to sign the Declaration. This never happened. There was no signing of the Declaration. There was no moment where they all got together in a room and signed this, like in this case. There's actually a lot of fear. When one guy, two guys actually signed it, Elbridge Gerry and another guy signed it. One guy was kind of larger and more obese than the other, and the other guy was smaller and thin. He's like, you're lucky when you get hung for what we're doing here, you're gonna break your neck and die right away. But when I get hung, I'm gonna be dancing up there on the gallows for hours. So a little what we call gallows humor there, as they are basically what they think are signing their death warrant when they sign the Declaration of Independence. That they're committing treason now in what they think is an ideological revolution against the enemy above, who has not taken away all their rights. So what are the key takeaways that we've learned about the enemy from above? What do you think? Maybe you got a good picture of the revolution now, a more holistic, nuanced one. First, oh, look, I got my fireworks there, see? Americans developed a conspiratorial fear of individuals with too much power, of large standing armies, of strong centralized governments. Americans hate the idea of a large standing army. It wasn't until after World War II that we had kind of a standing army in peacetime. Usually we have wars, and then all the veterans get cycled back into civilian life, and then we have a war 2 decades from then, and we go into the first battle, and we all suck in the battle because they haven't been trained, because we're bringing citizens back into becoming soldiers again. Since the end of World War II and the Cold War, large standing army has been a presence as America's moved towards a more activist, interventionist role throughout the world. They also feared strong centralized government. What would you say is more powerful today? The state of Kansas government or the state or the United States government? Who's got more power? By a lot, right? For a long time in American history, they owed more allegiance to their state than the federal government, because Americans really feared federal government having too much power. Americans developed a national identity based upon resistance to government to protect their individual rights and liberties and being imposed upon them from the federal government. And finally, they developed mythic stories of their national origins as a way to basically develop what do we value? Our freedoms, our liberties, not being imposed or impressed upon by a large foreign government, a power, or external enemies, but also our own government. So who is the enemy above? As we're kind of setting off this next module. Who is the enemy above? Our leaders, our government leaders, our business oligarchs. Remember the Allegheny Uprising, merciless traders who impose upon us, the government who imposes on us. That is the enemy above. And so when we get into this module as we're moving forward, what we're going to start learning about in this class is how that shapes and develops over the next couple hundred years. And so I'll talk a lot about militias and the Second Amendment and gun rights and the NRA. So on Friday, we'll talk about the NRA, the National Rifle Association. And Professor Whitford, upon his return, he's going to talk about the origins of the government power that begins to emerge, the FBI, the CIA, how government has emerged as a force, which thus creates the conditions for the emergence of a new militia movement, mostly after Vietnam, which we'll talk about that when they start to want to fight back against our own government that they view as too scary and powerful. So we'll talk about things like Waco, Oklahoma City, Ruby Ridge, all things of the last 30 years that have developed as a response. So that's kind of where we're headed.